She thought she had inherited fields and a house. What came with the deed was a door that would only open from the inside. The name of the estate was Santa Helena. Its address, when it mattered to the law, was the freguesia of Bananao, in the interior of São Paulo, the year roughly 1830. To the people who lived along the dirt roads and the thin line of a parish road, Santa Helena had been a breathing thing for too long, part rumor, part ruin, part an old man's last will. To Joanna, who had cared for the man who died, it was a place she arrived at with nothing but a thin satchel, a few coins and hands that knew how to bind, soothe, and keep others alive. Joanna had been there in the end, wiping the forehead of Felisberto Barreto as the sweat cooled into the smell of wet cloth and coffee. She had seen his hands tremble when he clutched the old iron key that hung on a ribbon at his throat, the way a man holds something he owes the world or owes himself. She had heard him in the small hours say the names of people in riddles, as if debt and protection were the same thing. When he died, he left more than land. He left a silence that reached farther than the distance from the drawing room to the cellar. Santa Helena was larger than the house on the letterhead made it sound. In the rain, it exhaled damp wood and the sour brightness of sugar fermenting in the rafters. In the dry months, it exhaled dust, each grain a small memory of horses and the hard work of harvest. The main house was a long-bodied thing, verandas with flaking white, shutters swollen and stuck in summer, a low-tiled roof scattered with lichen. There were rooms that smelled of coffee grounds kept in sacks, a library of leather-bound ledgers that hissed when you thumbed them, and long corridors that seemed to collect breath and keep it. When the judicial notary read the will in the parish square, people came not merely out of curiosity, but from a long apprenticeship in listening for what inheritance does to a village. The document pronounced Joanna, named as the woman who had tended the coronel's last nights, the heir of Santa Helena. Coronel Felisberto had no children of his own who survived, only nephews in Recife and a cousin in São Paulo, and so the estate went to the person who had kept him from dying alone. The will was neat, legal, and a little like a hand closing. The reaction in Bananao was not loud. It was a long series of small exhalations. At the church steps, the priest touched the brim of his hat twice, but looked away when Joanna passed. Elias, the foreman, kept his mouth shut for a day and then came to the house under pretext of measuring stock and inspecting the mill. He wore the kind of expression that is taught by years of making decisions you are not proud of, one that looks for the balance between what is possible and what is just. Joanna was not the sort of woman people imagined as an owner. She was slender, work-roughened, with hair that had once been braided and now escaped in thin wisps at the nape of her neck. Her hands were square and sure. They moved as though their first job was to check for harm before anything else. She had learned in small houses and sick rooms to notice smell as one notices smoke. She could tell the difference between fever sour and the dry scent of old blood. That skill had been the thing that had kept Felisberto breathing a little longer than he might otherwise have. She had inherited more than the house. There were ledgers and deeds and the iron key, still warm from where the coronel had touched it in his last morning. There was also a reputation, a rumor as heavy and sticky as molasses, that the house had never been empty since Felisberto's wife, Constanza, was said to have died. People spoke of it in ways they thought were casual, as if by naming it lightly they denied the weight of what had been done there. They said the house kept its own counsel, like a chest that will not be opened by anyone but itself. Joanna understood small cruelties because she had seen them up close, the cruelties of poverty, the cruelties a man in power can pay for in order to keep reputation polished. But she did not understand how a house could consume a secret and then go on living as though nothing had happened. Her first nights at Santa Helena were an audit of particulars. She walked the rooms with a lantern, watching how the light pooled and how the wallpaper faded to a pattern of old storms. She opened drawers and found receipts for tobacco, for sugar, for servants who had left and never come back. There were jars of lavender tucked behind books, their scent a polite echo of a woman who had once claimed the rooms. The house remembered Constanza, not in portrait alone but in small hospitality. A silver tray, the faint stain of perfume on a handkerchief, the ripple of flowered fabric caught in a drawer. The first puzzle presented itself in the library, where Felisberto had kept ledgers and a closet for papers. Joanna was clearing dust from shelves when she found it. A row of books whose spines are lined too perfectly, their titles a tidy lie. When she pressed the side of the false shelf, it gave with a hollow sound like a throat trying not to cough. The shelf swung away, and a narrow stair revealed itself. Tightly carved stone leading down into a dark that smelled of iron and river. She did not struggle to make herself brave. She had no need for false courage in the face of architecture. She lit another lantern and followed the stair, each step sending up a small puff of must. The stair ended in a low passage, brick curved, and in the center a door of iron, black with age. It was thick enough to be a coffin lid. Around its rim, the mortar was old and dry. A ferrolio, an iron bolt, spanned it, set into brackets that had been forged by someone who knew that if a thing must be locked, it must be made to last. The bolt had a curious contrivance. The bar of iron slid into a socket on the inner side. The mechanism could not be reached from the outer face of the door. There were no external handles, no keyholes. The only way to unfasten it was from inside the chamber. The ferrolo was simple in its cruelty, a lock that answered only a hand within. Joanna ran her palm over the iron and felt for seams. She felt the faint rays of someone having hammered the brackets, workmanlike, precise, patient. There was old oil in the hinges. In the joints there was an accumulation of dust that had been pressed into place over years. When she knocked once, twice, the sound that answered was not an echo, but a muffled metallic scrape, like a hand moving metal from the inside. It was the single sound that made every hair on her arm stand up. Precise, domestic, impossible. She could have walked away then. The house would not have noticed. But she had been with people when they were afraid to speak up. She had learned that silence is not always a kindness. Sometimes it becomes a collusion with harm. She placed her ear against the iron and heard, beneath the scrape, a smell, lavender and soap, and a faint musk of old wine. Kate told her, in the way only familiar things tell the body, that the place beyond the door had been tended by someone with rituals and dignity. When she left the cellar, Joanna did not rush to the villagers with her discovery. Rumor in Bananao could be like yeast, a small thing that swelled and poisoned bread. Instead, she went to the pantry, where the house's shapes could be understood in plainness. The pantry had a narrow channel in the floor, a conduit so small it could only be used for food or for passing messages. There were marks on its ledge, careful, repeated scrapes of a spoon against stone. Behind the traces were stains that had been smeared and then washed. Someone had taken care to leave no obvious tracks. It took Joanna some hours to assemble the meaning the pantry spoke. The channel allowed a tray to pass from the kitchen to the stair space below, and the stair space in front of the iron door allowed for the provisioning of something that could not be received visitors in the open. The mechanism was old, methodical, human-made. Someone had fed whatever or whoever lived behind that iron barrier for years. Here, in the practical arrangement of boards and stone, the question that had been only a rumor turned into a fact. The house was not a mausoleum. It was an infrastructure of concealment. The idea settled over Joanna like a physical weight. She had never lived anywhere that required this kind of secrecy. She had never inquired into other people's private arrangements. Yet now she was the heir, the legal steward, the person the law might call owner, if anything else were to come into question. Ownership, she knew, carried responsibilities that could not be measured simply in pesetas or acres. At dusk that evening, Elias arrived with a lantern and an expression on his face, like a ledger that had been balanced and found wanting. He had been the coronel's foreman for years. He understood the ways a farm kept itself and the ways men kept family matters from prying eyes. He had stood against fires and droughts and quarrels between labourers, and he had always chosen what would most preserve the farm's productivity. He had little patience for rumour, but when Joanna told him about the door, he did not laugh. "You know the story," Elias said, hands on his hips. "About Constanza." Joanna nodded. She had heard it all her life. Constanza had died young, the story went, leaving a beauty and a scandal, a sigh that the coronel could not close. He had loved her, or he had loved what she made him be, which many people thought of as the same thing. When she died, the coronel grieved in a way that domestics said was controlled and meticulous. He paid for flowers and kept sharp notes in his ledgers. He redecorated rooms and later, people speculated, he began to build mechanisms. Elias did not give Joanna the whole truth. No one in Bananao did, not willingly. People preserved parts of the truth the way they preserved trousers and shoes, until the seams began to give. He told her that the house had secrets that were meant to be kept, and it had rules about who got to keep them. He told her, without saying it outright, that the presence of a living person behind that iron door would implicate more than one family, maybe the coronel's honor, maybe the labor that fed the estate, maybe the church. He warned, in a tone as neutral as pitch, that some secrets are structural. They support the house the way rafters support a roof. Joanna listened and thought of Felisberto's last days, the way he had clung to ritual, the way he had touched the iron key and then pressed it to his chest as if feeling for a pulse. She also thought of the bandages she had wrapped across the plate of his chest in the final feverish nights, of sinking into a chair while the midwives fussed, and of the way he had once, in a sudden lucid hour, said that some things must be protected even from those who love them. She had heard that as a proverb about reputation, but now it sounded like an instruction manual for silence. The simplest practicalities presented themselves. Someone had to feed, someone had to clean, someone had to bring water down the stair without being seen. Whoever did that work could not be a man who lived openly on the estate. The rhythms of farm life would make them suspicious. Therefore the concealment required complicity that reached beyond one room. Who fed the hidden chamber? Who held the key in practice? Who could be persuaded to look away and why? These were questions that had neither easy moral answers nor tidy legal ones. There were other hints, small and domestic. Joanna found a single cup hidden under a loose brick at the back of the pantry, a cup with a faint lavender stain on the rim. There were scraps of fabric, neatly rolled, as if a hand had bent them to save space. The ledgers mentioned a Mrs. C once, the entry a single line of payment for services rendered, with a sum small enough to keep discreet and large enough to indicate discomfort. The coronel had been a man accustomed to arranging the world as he wished. He had wealth, and the habit of turning even scandal into ledger entries. Joanna did not sleep that night. She sat with her lamp on the low table and read and reread the will until the letters became the only thing left on the page. The lantern made the ink glisten like small wounds. She could have sold the estate and been rid of its weight. She could have taken the money and gone to town. But she had watched a man die with his hands seeking continuity, some small proof that what he had done would remain intact after his breath left him. Perhaps that was a sentiment she ought to judge. Instead, she felt something that was not pity and not justice, but a kind of duty shaped by human frailty. She had grown used to preventing immediate harm. She had never had to manage the slow harm of a secret, the kind that soothes one man at the cost of another's life. On the second morning, a cart appeared on the lane. Dust rose like a pale curtain, and with it came two men whose names were already whispered in letters that had travelled faster than they had, Teodoro and Augusto, nephews of Felisberto. They arrived like claims do, neat, loud, confident that the world had been arranged to serve them. They were not men of the farm. Their coats were cut in a style that did not belong to the mud and sweat of Bananao. They had the quick insolence of people taught to expect inheritance as a right. Their eyes spoke of entitlement before their voices did. They asked for the papers. They asked about Felisberto's bed. They asked, with clean hands folded, whether the will had been properly witnessed. When Joanna met them, she watched the way their fingers brushed the key the coronel used to carry at his throat. They wanted the object's story as much as its metal. They were men prepared to consume a family's apparatus in order to make money of it, and they had the kind of impatience that turned curiosity into violence. They were brusque, and where they could not be brusque they attempted charm. Joanna felt the village's attention from the windows like a pressure. She saw in her mind how the nephews might look at the iron door, not as a place perhaps that required feeding, but as a hiding of valuables. In their calculus a sealed room could contain treasure. They reasoned with that hungry greed that sees only what can be sold or divided. Their arrival complicated every private calculation Joanna had been making. Elias watched their coming and said nothing, but his silence had the taste of a man who knew how such things ended. The priest crossed himself in the doorway and said small prayers that sound like trying to hold a crack closed with a finger. In the market the next day, The townspeople divided into conspiracies and cautions. Some said the nephews would sell off the estate to outsiders who would rent their land and forget the names of those who had fed the hidden chamber. Some said the nephew's arrival would result in a clean sweep, boxes of money, relocation, and the final disappearance of the coronel's old myths. Others said that it would all end badly, and that they had seen such ends before. A man who wants his property and another man who does not want to be seen will always create a collision. Joanna measured the nephews not only by their hands, but by a small cruelty. They laughed when Elias told the story of Constanza, without understanding that the tale had a face. They treated the past like a rumor to be mined for profit. Joanna felt the weight of a decision that had begun to press on her chest. Decide to tell, and the nephews might expose the secret without mercy. Refuse to tell, and she would be complicit in the maintenance of a life lived in the shadow of a bolt. Neither path was clean. She began in those first hectic days to make the estate a place of small disguises. She closed up rooms not out of a need to hide, but because the maintenance required time she did not have. She sent workers to mend fences and to isolate the house's public face from its private looms. She asked simple questions. Where had certain payments come from? Who had access to the coronel's private ledgers? And watched how the answers either slid away or caught like fish on hooks. It was Teodoro who first suggested that the cellar might contain bullion. He paced the dairy and spoke in images. Vaults beneath floors, loopholes for treasure, secret statutes. "Old men keep old things," he said, his hand absent-mindedly resting on the iron key like a boy touching a toy. Augusto nodded, eyes on the door, as if the iron could not contain a mystery that had business in the market. Joanna heard them, and heard the way the land around them held its breath. The farm could be made profitable by new hands, or it could be made into a rumor that would never let the village sleep. It could give up its secret and be looted. Joanna had been taught, by years of tending to others, to choose immediate care over abstract righteousness. When a fever comes, you treat the fever. When a wound is bleeding, you bind it. But sometimes there are wounds that pulse for years beneath cloth, and treating them will take time, embarrassment, and the willingness to live with unease. One evening, while the nephews argued with Elias over the placement of a new storehouse, and the priest muttered that such disputes were bad for the souls of men, Joanna returned to the iron door. She had not yet seen anything beyond it. She had found the feeding channel, the cup, the scraps of cloth, and an economy of small favors that could explain why the corridor had remained so tidy. But she wanted to know whether, beyond the iron, there was a human voice. She put her ear to the mortar and listened. There was the sound of the farm above her, a low and steady breathing of animals, carts creaking, far-off calls. Beneath all of it was another sound, soft, like the friction of a spoon against a dish, the careful movement of a body that had learned to calibrate every motion to avoid creating a noise that could not be explained away. Joanna did not call out. She had the practical sense of those who know that sometimes asking a question aloud is itself an act of accusation. Instead, she rapped on the iron twice with the edge of her lantern. The scrape answered, deliberate and immediate. Then, in the thin gap beneath the door, a light as slight as a breath passed, a wisp of lavender-scented air. It moved across her face and left a faint, domestic fragrance, the sort you feel at the edges of memory. The presence beyond the door had been prepared for careful arrivals. Someone had been expecting small kindnesses from the world and had arranged the house to receive them without being discovered. That someone, Joanna realized, had not been merely kept like an object. They had been tended to with a level of ceremony that belonged to women who had not lost their pride. There was an intelligence in the way the channel's rim had been smoothed. There was a dignity in the way the cup had been hidden under the brick. For the first time, Joanna spoke. Her voice was low, the same tone she had used at Felisberto's bedside when she admonished him to breathe. "Who are you?" she asked. There was a pause, measured as if by a clock inside. Then a voice came through the iron, soft, controlled, with a command of language that suggested someone who had been taught how to manage very little so that what could be had seemed vast. "Constanza," it said. The word was an offering and a claim, Hearing that name in the concrete dark made the room tilt. Joanna thought of portraits and handkerchiefs and the faint perfume on the cup. Constanza, who had been said to have died, whose death had once been marked with black cloth and rumors of fever. Constanza, spoken in the present, as if she had simply been out of sight. The voice was not hysterical. It was not an accusation. It was a person state, careful, wary, and with reserve. That reserve had to have been practiced for years. The ability to speak in small, neutral cadences keeps the listener from becoming curious enough to break rules. Someone who has survived by practice will use language to hold off intrusion. Joanna had been close to deathbeds before, and she recognized in that voice a shaped life. Education in speaking to men of property and power, the sound of someone who has been taught to compact fury into polite reticence. There was danger in such reserve because it allowed survival to be dignified and therefore more palatable to those who might otherwise feel discomfort. Joanna also recognized in the voice an intelligence, a honeyed, dangerous cunning that had been ground on stone for years. "Why are you here?" Joanna asked, though the question was a poor probe in a place where answers were layered. There came a soft exhale. "Because it was possible," the voice said. "Because he could pay for discretion, because he chose it." The lantern in Joanna's hand threw a thin circle on the iron and did not penetrate the darkness beyond. She felt suddenly very much alone in the way people are alone when they understand that a decision that will affect many other people will be theirs to make. In the next room above, someone closed a door. The villagers moved on with their lives. Only the house and the two women and the hidden metal barrier held a secret between them. If Joanna had been a different sort of woman, one with a clearer sense of legal propriety, or one who felt the public need for scandal, she might have marched to Bananao and told the priest, the captain, anyone who would put law and order in motion. But she had looked into the eyes of a dying man and had seen the precise economy of his last choices. The coronel had used his power to keep a woman alive in a way that ensured his name would be safe. That choice, whatever its motives, had left a living person dependent on others' refusal to know. "What will you do?" the voice asked, as if the person beyond the iron sensed the same ledger that now logged both moral columns in Joanna's mind. Joanna exhaled. "I will not let you die from neglect," she said. It was not a promise to accept everything. It was a promise to not allow immediate harm where she could prevent it. "But I will not help you exact harm on others," she added, and even to her own ears the words sounded like a hinge being set. She had no plan beyond that moment. She had only an intention, and intentions are fragile things when they meet the determined will of men like Teodoro and Augusto. The voice made a small sound that could have been a laugh or the tightening of a thread. "You will discover that there are more complications than you imagine," it said. "Such arrangements are not made to be unpicked." Joanna understood the meaning of those words. She also understood that whatever arrangements existed were not the legal property of someone who had never owned them. She legally now held the deed. She was the one who would be questioned if brought into court. She would be the one the law could reach. That reality had a chill to it that no amount of lantern light could counteract. Outside, the nephews continued to stake their claim on the estate as if it were an unattended warehouse. They assumed hands would bend to their will. Inside, the house held its breath and waited to see whether its secret would be preserved. Joanna closed the door to the stair and sat with her back against the wall. The iron under her hand was warm from the lantern's heat, and the sound of the farm above was a kind of oblivion. There were choices to make and people to be consulted, but consultation could be a betrayal. She was not a woman with a network of powerful protectors. She had only her skill in keeping the immediate from becoming worse, her understanding of the body, and a stubbornness that had been used as a tool in the small lives she had kept. She thought of the servants who had once worked at Santa Helena. How many of them might be persuaded to maintain a silence? How many of them had been paid to do just that by Felisberto? The ledger suggested complicity, the kind that passes down through habit, because it has always kept the farm intact. The moral calculus was not simple. Expose and risk a frenzy that could harm the hidden person. Conceal and risk becoming party to a slow domination that corrupted every life connected to the house. In the days that followed, Joanna moved as though walking the rim of a deep well. She examined ledgers and found notes in the coronel's hand, small notations about deliveries at odd hours, payments to carriers with names scratched out, and a line dating back decades about the necessity of discretion for the family. She listened to the workers and watched how they averted their eyes from that part of the house. She tasted the air around her and recognized the perfume beneath the dust as an old strategy. Make comfort smell familiar so that those who enter accept it as ordinary. All these were signs of an operation cultivated over years. Elias, for his part, began to see Joanna's cautious approach as wisdom rather than timidity. He brought her a worn journal one night, the coronel's private notes, and in the margins of those pages were entries that read like a man trying to dictate gentleness across his misdeeds. "She must be kept from harm," one line read. Another, in a firmer hand, "No exposure, family intact." There was a tenderness in some lines and an arrogance in others. The coronel had loved method more than he had loved explanation. The nephews, ignorant of the subtleties and hungry for profit, started to ask pointed questions in front of the workers. Joanna saw that their approach was to scatter inconvenience until someone yielded. She adjusted the daily rhythms of the farm to counter their prying. She kept more laborers at the fields, she scheduled milk runs when the nephews were away, and she demanded that whoever delivered supplies do so at times that masked their purpose. These were small defensive moves. They did not address the root of the problem, but they kept the house from being stripped of its scaffolding. And through all of it, the iron door remained a dark promise. Joanna visited it often, like someone checking a patient's room. She placed small items beneath the lip of the door, a cup of broth, a wrapped ration, watching the way the hand beyond would take them and leave nothing unnecessary. The gestures were private and ritualized. An economy based on secrecy creates its own etiquette. The hidden must accept the limits of what others will give. The visible must ration compassion into forms that will not be theft. One morning, as rain moved across the tiles and the farm seemed temporarily hermetic, Joanna found a note slipped beneath her pillow. It was folded with care and written in a hand that, to her trained eye, held both elegance and the trace of long practice. The script said only, "We must speak when the roast is cool," a sly demand for a private meeting in the kitchen. Joanna felt the set of her shoulders change. An invitation was a dangerous thing. It could be a trap, a test, or a genuine claim for conversation. She did not know which it would be. The lunch that day was a small, careful affair. The kitchen was lit by a thin sun that filtered through a curtain. Joanna prepared the roast and let it cool as the note suggested. The house hummed with ordinary noises, water in cauldrons, the slap of a broom, and yet every shadow felt like a listener. She sat at the table and waited. When the door beneath the pantry opened that day, it opened from the inside. The sound startled her more than any other thing had done so far. It was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It was the quiet click of an old bolt being drawn, the same precise movement she had long suspected existed but had not heard. The panel beyond shifted, and a small head emerged, dark hair pinned back, eyes that met Joanna's with a look not plaintive, but exacting. Constance's face was not what the portraits promised. It was marked by restraint, by the architecture of a life made narrow and strong. She climbed up the narrow stair with the ease of someone who had practiced the motion. Her dress was clean, her hands had a slight color from the sun despite her seclusion. She moved with the confidence of a person who knows how to hide in plain sight while still possessing authority. When she reached the kitchen, her perfume, lavender and something darker like ground spice, rose and filled the room in a way that felt almost improvisational. "How old are you?" Constanza asked Joanna, not as a stranger, but as someone who had been reading the ledger of gestures. It was a way of mapping the younger woman, testing for patience, for endurance, for how much she could bear. Joanna named her age and watched Constanza's face for signs of shock or pity. There was none. There was only a steady curiosity. "You are young to be the one left with these seams," Constanza said. Her voice had a quality of measured observation, an appraisal formulated into a sentence. "Do you know how the farm runs? Do you know who will come to take what you wish to keep?" Joanna met her eyes and felt for the first time the full force of what the choice meant. To protect a living person who had been concealed in order to keep a family name intact, to bear the burden of a secret that could ruin her if revealed, and ruin others if concealed. There was no glory in being the keeper of such a secret. There was only the work of living with the consequences. Constanza sat without ceremony, and spoke as one who had kept conversation as a skill. She told in fragments that were almost mechanical the reason she had died in the eyes of others: a fever, a staged funeral, a ledger entry. She admitted to being fed and coddled by a man who had authority enough to purchase discretion. She did not ask for pity. She asked for recognition. She had arranged her life in the shape she could survive. Her voice contained no apology and no plea. It contained the clarity of someone who had learned the hard arithmetic of survival. "You will find," she said, "that protection requires a price. Some prices are paid in coin, others are paid in silence that yeasts into law." Joanna listened and felt that sentence as a bruise. She thought not of laws, but of hands that had fed, and hands that had withheld. She thought of Felisberto's last chest of keys, and of the iron ferrolho that could only be slid from the inside. She understood with increasing sharpness that whoever had set up the mechanism had done so with an idea not of punishment, but of preservation. Preservation for whom? For honor, for life, for power. Outside, the nephews continued their small, impatient wars. Inside, a woman who had once been pronounced dead had risen at the sound of roast meat cooling to test a stranger's mettle. Joanna found herself on a narrow ridge between two forces: a social order that would crumble under the wrath of men like Teodoro and Augusto, and a private obligation that demanded the caretaking of a human being who had lived as if she were both a secret and a sovereign. When Constanza rose to leave, she did so with the precise dignity of someone who knows the cost of being seen. She paused at the doorway and looked back at Joanna. "We are not children," she said. "We know how to decide." Joanna watched her go and felt the house settle, as if an animal had found its place in the night. The iron door closed and the bolt slid into place, its sound a small, intimate click. Joanna found herself alone with a decision she had not asked for, and a knowledge that would shape the farm for years to come. Outside, the nephews argued over fences. Inside, the house smelled of roast and lavender, and a sorrow that had the flatness of long practice. Joanna sat at the table and rolled her thumbs across the wooden grain. She felt the weight of the key the coronel had worn at his throat in her pocket. It was not a key to that iron door, she had seen that. It was a token of a man's late attempt to contain his choices. That token now moved in her pocket like an accusation. She knew, with the slow clarity of someone who must act, that every small choice she made from this point would have implications not merely for her, but for the village, for the nephews, for the hidden woman, and for the memory of the coronel. She could announce everything and risk a storm that would ravage more than the estate. She could bury the truth and carry the weight alone. She could try to find a third way, one that would convert an illicit lifeline into a lawful protection, but law in Bananao often lags behind what men with money demand. Her nights became a balance of poring over ledgers and listening to the house. She learned minutely the schedule of the person behind the door. When she moved, the slight clank at mid-morning, when she breathed more deeply after a late hour. Joanna began to set her own small rituals in relation to those sounds. She would leave a cup set in a precise place and watch for it to be taken. She would alter the times of deliveries so that the hidden person would not be startled. She did this not because she thought it right in any abstract sense, but because she had decided that immediate human care must trump the abstract morality that might have put someone at risk. Elias, who watched her with the kind of respect that comes from seeing someone make hard choices well, said one night, "You will be tempted to think small. You will be tempted to say that a single body is less than a village's peace. But small choices accrete like rust. You will have to decide whether you will be the one who polishes the metal or the one who lets it corrode." Joanna did not answer immediately. She understood that Elias's words were not just counsel, but a description of the sorts of moral rot that happen where silence is chosen for convenience. She also knew that the world beyond Santa Helena had no patience for nuance. Men like Teodoro and Augusto demanded absolutes. Either the secret was revealed and plundered, or the secret secured under their control. Morning after morning, the house gave up a small piece of its story. A ledger entry, a servant who remembered a midnight errand, a scrap of cloth, a tooth mark under the pantry rim where rats had chewed. In each piece, Joanna saw the structure of a life built to survive. She also saw the faltering hands of a man who had chosen to create a private refuge rather than face scandal. Felisberto's choices had been both cruel and protective. They had been motivated by a desire to preserve a name and by a reluctance to allow public shame to enter his household. The moral cost would be borne by those who must live with the consequences. Joanna began to imagine, in small practical ways, how to convert the secret into something less capable of breeding power. She thought of opening the house under conditions that would place the hidden woman into a public role, but she could not imagine how to do that without risking immediate harm. The nephews would buy such a scandal and sell it as rumor. The priest would demand the church's claim. The law would be slow and male, and Joanna could not rely on it to be timely. Thus, before knowing all that will come, she formed a plan of small defenses. She would keep the house running. She would employ staff who would be paid directly from the estate's income, and who did not owe fealty to the nephews. She would keep the iron door's existence a matter between herself and a handful of trusted people. She would not give in to the nephews. She would not give in to the nephews. That decision shaped the next weeks as surely as weather shapes a harvest. It was not a bright, dramatic resolve, but a set of steady, often ugly choices. When to answer a knock, which ledger lines to hide, which questions to meet with a quiet that was not denial but a refusal to accelerate harm. Teodoro and Augusto grew more insistent. They patrolled the grounds with the kind of easy belligerence that believes force ends debate. They mocked the old house as if mockery could dislodge secrets. They prodded workers with their gloved hands, asking for rumors as if gossip were a map. They demanded to inventory the cellar. They threatened to bring in men from the town to open every lock. Each day they edged closer to violence, simply because entitlement finds impatience a convenient instrument. Joanna watched them and learned to read their impatience like a new sort of weather. It was blunt, hot, the kind of thing that made men lift voices and hands. She met it with measures small enough to avoid public scenes, but large enough to shape consequence. She shuffled accounts. She arranged for supplies to be registered under names that would not betray how provisions reached the hidden stair. She paid wages in plain coin and kept receipts that created the paper of plausible deniability. There were no heroic acts in these days, only logistics and the slow, patient work of keeping a fragile thing from shattering. Elias proved an ally in a way the village had not predicted. He was careful and quietly fierce, a man who spoke rarely and whose judgments were formed by toil rather than rhetoric. He told Joanna what she already suspected. Reputations could be preserved by the strong, and the weak were often taught to live between those forces. If Felisberto had bought the silence that fed Constanza, then Elias, at least, would take the portion of his conscience that could be lent to another person and lend it. He marshaled a handful of loyal laborers who could be trusted not to sell gossip for drink money. He watched the nephews like a hawk watches a fox that comes near the coop. The sooner the nephews came to believe they could not simply seize what they wanted, the more dangerous their tactics became. They attempted once to force the iron door from its outer face, an act of brutish curiosity meant to prove that everything can be taken if enough men try. They found themselves facing not only iron but timing, and in that timing, Joanna recognized who had true mastery of the house. Not the family that owned the land on paper, but the woman who had learned, over years of concealment, the structures that made the place safe. It was not Constanza who met them first. The nephew's first serious incursion occurred when they sent a group of hired hands, barrow-laden and confident, down the back stair to strip the cellar of anything that could be turned into coin. They pushed past the pantry, laughing, and stooped over the lip of the hidden stair as if peering into a well of gold. The sound they made on the narrow stone was childish, footsteps that believed they would be rewarded for boldness. What happened next unfolded with a swift and terrible ordinary logic. Felisberto's house had been built to keep the secret intact, and in doing so, it had accumulated features that were now waiting to be used with a woman's precise malice, rather than a dead man's will. The hired men found themselves in a place whose architecture betrayed them. Slippery stone, hidden thresholds, a sump of old water. These things do not conspire with intention. They align with the accident of motion caused by clumsy feet and overconfidence. There were noises, a cry that stopped short, the wet sound of a fall, a scuffle, a lamp knocked from a hand and the slow hissing of oil into stone. Joanna, who heard only a fragment of the chaos from above, ran as fast as a woman with lantern light and an understanding of how bodies move could run. She descended into a scene of collapsed men and clanking metal. She saw the nephew's hired hands sprawled like punctuation marks across the cellar floor. They were not pretty, no poetry in the way a body lies, but neither were they trophies of gore. They were accidents made by arrogance, and the house, with its stern iron door, had simply not yielded to the rude interference. It was Teodoro and Augusto who arrived seconds later, breathless and pale with the speed of their own malicious energy. They had come with threats and had expected a spectacle of theft. They found, instead, collapsed servants and an immediate moral problem. They did not see in that scene the workings of a woman's restraint or the brittle craft of Felisberto's precautions. They saw only a chance to step into command. They shouted and ordered and kicked at things. They demanded the identity of whoever had mismanaged their men. Joanna met them in the threshold of the cellar with a quiet that frightened them more than any shout. She called them by name and told them the bottom line: the workers had been hurt. They required aid. Her voice carried professional authority, an outsider's precise remittance of duty that the nephews could not easily dismiss because it mapped onto a visible human need. They grumbled and swore, and then they started to probe the stairs as though pulling a thread might unwind everything. Here, in the narrow dark where history and household met, the matter finally broke into something that could not be smoothed by receipts. Teodoro shoved aside a curtain and tried the iron rim with the kind of insolent hand that had never known punishment. The farolho, old and stubborn, answered with its same cruel silence. During the shove, a mechanism, either a rusted lever or a curious shift of weight in the floor, gave under his foot. The sound it made was not cinematic, but practical. It was the noise of old things snapping under the force of deliberate misuse. In the suddenness of it, Teodoro lost his balance and collapsed against a brace of iron built for purposes Joanna did not have to name. The wall answered with a strange, final logic. Men moving with the arrogance of entitlement were ill-fitted to the contraptions of those who had designed concealment for survival. Augusto lunged forward, and the world tightened to the squeal of metal and the heavy footfalls of men who had not accounted for the quiet knowledge of a woman who had been living inside the house's rhythms for decades. He fell too, and the two nephews' cries turned raw and sharp. Joanna shoved her lantern toward them, hands steady as if she did not feel the wildness inside her. She found herself thinking not of law, but of care. How to stop bleeding, how to staunch panic. Her hands, practiced in binding and in treating fevered skin, moved automatically. She could not, in that first dizzy hour, determine whether their wounds were fatal. She could not tell whether the house had simply reasserted its will against intruders, or whether the architecture had been used with intent. When dawn unraveled, there were two things Joanna could no longer delay. Men lay unmoving in the dirt of the cellar, and the village would hear about trouble. She closed her eyes and did not see the neat ledger lines, but the real weight of choice. To bring the matter into the light would mean magistrates and questions, and perhaps a public scandal that could not be contained. To hide it would bind her to a secrecy that had already proven how imperfect its protections could be. She chose containment at first, from the muscle memory of a woman who had once knelt by a dying man and trusted herself to secure his breathing. She wrapped the bodies simply and without ceremony and moved them into a place where, with help from Elias and two old laborers who owed more than wages, she buried them under the earth beyond the barn. It was not a plan worked through with philosophy. It was a pragmatic act to prevent the village from being drawn into blood and accusation. She left no grand eulogies to paper. She left only soil and silence. This action was not without consequence. The nephews discovered, by the time they were dragged from whatever machines or pitfalls the cellar offered, that their hired men were gone. They found only the scent of lavender and the resolute face of Joanna. They turned their fury outward with a shrillness that has always accompanied those who lose what they think is theirs. They accused the workers of theft and Joanna of complicity. They lamented loudly to any who would listen that the estate had been defrauded. They demanded the law. They arrived at the priest and at the notary and declared that the house had become a snare. Some of the parish listened, Rumor, like a bird, alights where it will. The priest said cautious words about sin and the need for truth to be known, but he also knew how difficult legal structures were to force in a province where money and land bought far more than justice. He crossed himself and moved like a man who must mediate between flames. Elias, seeing that judicial inquiry might lead to worse violence, men from Recife, soldiers, outsiders who would not care for anyone inside but themselves, pressed for a different way. He would stand witness to the facts as he saw them and pledge his labourers' silence if Joana kept up a steady hand. Constanza spoke for the first time to the village that week. She did not step into the square and proclaim the intimate details. She summoned a single, well-chosen word to a woman who returned with the priest's slow mercy. She declared privately that she would take blame into her chest and not let it burst. Word of her willingness to be the sacrificial locus travelled back to Joana like a sting of cold water. Constanza, that day, placed herself in the role of absorbing exposure so that others would be spared the mob that Englishmen call justice and Iberians call vendetta. That choice was not the grand romance of patriotism. It was a hard economy. Joana understood then, with the unpleasant clarity that comes to those who must choose between harm and more harm, that one human's consent to be the point of rupture does not cleanse those who press the pivot. Conscience in such places is often reduced to triage. Which life is most at risk if this does not stop now? Joana was not blind to hypocrisy. She knew that a woman hidden for decades was both the victim and the perpetrator of a system of power. Constanza had been fed by wealth and had kept that quiet as a protection. Felisberto had been cruelly possessive and also, in his way, protective. None of it was simple. Joana watched the nephews, their faces a texture of rage and entitlement, and felt how dangerous it was to place coin and title above flesh. The village, in the weeks that followed, settled into a new, brittle quiet. They pretended to have explanations that were neat and comforting: a cave-in, an accident of the cellar, a punishment of greed. The notary took what could be recorded without provoking a sheriff, and the priest said prayers over men whose names he had only just met. Outside, buyers did not arrive as expected. The nephews sat on their grievances like two men marooned on a small island. If they pressed in a way that frightened women in the market to draw their shawls more snugly around their shoulders. Joana set about reshaping Santa Helena with a severity that was almost professional. She culled the house's inventory of certain luxuries that had been instruments of power rather than warmth. Where Felisberto had kept small things that felt like favors, fine linens, notes of social purchase, she replaced them with workaday objects that would not serve as instruments of manipulation. She hired women from a distance, people whose names and faces meant little to the nephews, and whose loyalties were to their wages. She instituted clear records of supplies that ran the channel, paying in coin and writing receipts that would stand up to casual scrutiny, not to legal subpoena. Constanza, meanwhile, altered the terms of her life in ways that complicated both compassion and control. She was no longer the absolute mistress of a private court. She accepted, after long conversation with Joana and Elias, regulated access to fresh air, to garden paths, and to limited visits under supervision. Joana insisted on conditions not because she wished to punish, but because she believed control in a narrow sense could limit the harm that absolute freedom might do in the hands of someone who had been built on secrecy. Constanza accepted those constraints with a dignity that was not concession but recognition. She acknowledged the complex arithmetic of survival and agreed to live within it as a trade. This arrangement was not a cure. It was a compromise, and it cost each of them differently. Joana lost sleep and gained a keener line of worry across her face. She wrote down payments and assigned certain tasks to people who would not ask blunt questions. She sometimes found that the weight felt like complicity. Other nights she leaned into the small tasks, the washing of sheets, the arranging of fresh water, because that labor was immediate and human in a way that law seldom is. Constanza, in the hours she had, taught herself new rituals. She learned to read names of workers who came by, to memorize their faces, to watch the way men handled tools. She would sit for small hours, peering out from curtained windows at the extent of the fields, and she would sometimes hum a song that no one could place. There were moments, rare and bright, when she walked, with Joana's permission, along the path to the mango trees, and let the sun strike her face. In those minutes she seemed more than the sum of the secret. She was a woman whose life had been bent into shapes that served others. Time, in this way, reformed Santa Helena. The crops were tended, as Joana insisted, and as Elias approved. She sold sugar and tobacco and rice, paid workers on time, kept accounts that matched the ledger's clear, sober reality. People noticed the change. The estate moved from the slow slide of ruin to a steadier, more disciplined productivity. In markets and the parish, there was talk of Joanna's competence. Some offered grudging praise, others whispered suspicion. Rumour never dies, it mutates. Those who could not reconcile the neat order with the hushed past spun theories and applied them like paint to familiar canvases. There were nights often when the iron door made its single private sound. Joana heard the bolt slide and felt the house exhale, as if relief and sorrow could be uttered in the same metal note. She listened to the way meal trays were accepted, the gentle scrape of cutlery that belonged to someone who had practiced restraint as a virtue. Sometimes she imagined the life behind the iron as it might have been, not merely a prison, but a court where small decisions were litigated in silence. Other times, she saw it clearly as what it had been. A cruel arrangement born of one man's delusions and one woman's survival. The nephews never fully recovered their hunger for the estate. They remained, rather, as reminders of how fragile order is when threatened by those who would profit from scandal. Teodoro drank, and his humor curdled. Augusto tried to keep up a persona of friendliness, but it wore thin, and his hands always fumbled the way men do when they are used to having things given them. They made occasional scenes, loud, entitled fits that quickly tire a town, but they were never again in the position to command Santa Helena. Their legal pressure became a background noise. Letters, threats, the occasional visit by men who wished to buy the estate in a whisper and whom Joana politely sent away. The most lasting consequence of those violent weeks was not the rearrangement of property or the hush of market gossip. It was the slow, subterranean scarring that layered the people who lived there. Joanna's nights were often carried by a restless mind. She sometimes dreamed of the iron door opening of its own accord, the farolho loosening like a mouth opening. In daylight she felt a steady professional fatigue, the kind that settles where someone has been made responsible for the welfare of others without the support of law. Constance's presence altered social patterns in ways Joana could not fully control. There were women who came to offer help in the fields and left with a look that mixed pity and fear. There were men who refused to look at the house when passing. There were children who found the story irresistible and grew up with the moral ambiguity of it as one of their earliest lessons. The parish priest found it harder to preach simple sin when confronted with a woman who had been both victim and instrument of protection. His sermons took on a pale hue of apology and a call to mercy that left some parishioners restless. Years passed. Seasons turned, each one a small proof that life persists despite complicated beginnings. Santa Helena produced sugar and raised cattle and paid wages. Joana, who had once been a caregiver in a small house, became the manager of an estate whose survival depended on discretion and hard labor. She never sought to glorify what had happened, and she never pretended that the choices were moral absolutes. She kept watch, she brewed tea, she counted coins, and she wrote in the ledger in the neat hand her mother had taught her, honest, stern, and practical. Constanza survived beyond what the village had once thought possible. She grew older and more subdued. Her voice, which had once been a carefully coiled thing, relaxed occasionally into softness. She taught the kitchen hands a few recipes that had been preserved by ritual. She taught them a quick domestic philosophy about saving ends of bread and the quiet art of making small moments of beauty. In private, she spoke to Joana of the nights she had knit the name of the coronel into the hems of her life, and of the strange gratitude and grief she felt for a protection purchased with secrecy. She did not absolve herself or Felisberto. She simply told Joana what memory she could afford, that she had never believed herself to be free, but that for a time she had believed herself to be visible in an economy that had a kind of value. The farm's new order did not abolish the door's symbolic power. That iron slab continued to be what it had always been, a dark hinge between inside and outside, a literal device that required a hand from within to grant exit. Joana, having the key to the house and the responsibility of the estate, never had the ability to make that bolt yield. She had the law on paper, and not always in force. She had the moral burdens and a degree of neighborly tolerance. She had above all a conviction that what she guarded could not be simplified to heroism or villainy. In years afterward, when young laborers would come and ask about Santa Helena's past, Joana would answer in a way that avoided dramatics. She would say, slowly, that the estate had had a history and that history carried both grave mistakes and acts of mercy. She would say that some secrets are like old wounds. They can be dressed and managed, but they rarely disappear. She taught them agriculture and bookkeeping, and the small skill of recognizing when a life requires immediate care rather than public demolition. The moral residue remained. Sometimes children of the village would ask what she had done with the nephews, and Joana would feel the old weight of soil in her hands and say nothing. Once, in a market, a woman whose husband had been one of those first men to be hired and then fall in the cellar approached her. She did not ask for money. She asked for recognition. Joana opened her mouth to apologize and found there were no words that could shave down the history to something tidy. She gave the woman a small sum and the honest promise that their wages would be secure. It was not reparation, only a form of acknowledgement. In the quiet of later afternoons, Joana would sometimes stand by the pantry door and listen to the house breathe. The iron ferrolho would click twice in an evening as Constanza closed herself in and out. Joana would press her palm to the wood and think about what inheritance means. It was not merely a matter of titles and land. It was an inheritance of choices, actions, and the responsibilities that follow. She thought of Felisberto and felt no tenderness for the man's hubris. She thought of the nephews and felt pity for their small entitled souls. She thought most often of Constanza, who had learned to turn secrecy into survival and who continued to live with the consequences. The years did not shiny the decisions. They made them part of an ordinary fabric. Joana aged in the way of someone who has taken on another's life and had to keep their own. A few more lines at the eyes, hands that worked with a small tremble now and then, and an inner steadiness that had been hammered out of necessity. She never celebrated what she had done. There were days when she would sit by the mango tree and allow herself a private grief. But she never regretted the immediate choice to keep a person alive, in the moment when exposure would have meant a public shaming and likely more violence. At the edge of town, people began over decades to speak of Santa Helena as an estate that had weathered storms. Some told versions that added color and cruelty in equal measure. Others softened the past so their own consciences might sleep. Neither tale was the whole truth. The truth, like the iron door, could not be opened except from the inside. It was a particular, personal thing that required courage and risk to reveal. In the end, the house remained the house. The iron door remained iron. Joana grew older and began to teach a woman she trusted how to keep accounts and how to place receipts so that the channel of the pantry could remain honest if someone ever demanded it. She made plans that leaned away from secrecy and toward the mundane obligations of a functioning estate. She did so because she hoped, perhaps in a small private corner of her mind, that the day might come when law and compassion would align enough to transform hiding into care. On one of her last walks through the grounds, she paused by the doorway through which the servants passed. She felt the same weight she had first felt when the coronel's warm key lay in her palm. In that moment she realized how many things inheritance could be. Deed, soil, debt, rumor, the shape of a woman's life lived behind iron. She understood that the true work of inheritance was not to possess, but to steward, to hold not only property but cost, remembering that every choice to keep silence has a price that will be paid in memory. She thought of the title she had read in the square so many years ago, and smiled without much laughter. She had indeed inherited a widow's farm, and with the land she had acquired a door that, in the most dreadful, precise way, only opened from the inside. That door had been a material object and a moral metaphor. It had held a living person, and by doing so, held a knot of obligation around Joana's life. In those final scenes, she did not pen a manifesto. She did not claim absolution. Instead, she planted a tree, young and stubborn near the old wall, and told the woman who would succeed her to watch how roots took hold. "Tend the earth," she said. "Tend the people. If there is to be truth, it must not be used as a weapon but as a medicine. You will be tempted by absolutes. Prefer, when you can, to be practical." The new steward, a woman with steady hands and a face that carried the same stubbornness Joanna had once possessed, listened and took notes. She closed her book with a small, reverent motion and kept the last chest of keys in a drawer marked simply, "For Records." She did not touch the iron ferrolo. The door remained, as it always had been, a mysterious hinge between inside and outside. Years later, when travellers stopped at the parish and asked about Santa Helena, they were told a story in various tones, some cruel, some soft. But the people who had lived through the affair spoke quietly, with a complexity that refused tidy moral judgments. They spoke of care and complicity, of a woman who had been hidden not wholly against her will, of a man who had used his power to preserve an image as much as a person, and of the young nurse who had inherited the mess and chosen, imperfectly and bravely, to keep harm from spreading where she could. The iron door kept its secret as much as it allowed for the necessities of life. It was a literal threshold and a moral test. It reminded those who lived at Santa Helena that some doors require being opened from the inside, not because the world outside must be barred forever, but because the truth of certain lives cannot be forced into the light without cutting what it might yet protect. If you were standing where Joanna stood, with hands that know how to heal and a ledger that knows debts, what would you have done? Would you have sounded the bells and called for justice, trusting that the law could protect the vulnerable? Or would you have chosen to keep the secret, to prevent the immediate carnage that exposure might bring, and to bear that burden yourself? There are no simple answers in Joanna's farm. There are only choices and the long seasons of consequence that follow them. If this story left you unsettled, consider sharing your thoughts. Tell us in the comments, would you expose the secret or keep it, knowing in either case that someone will be made to pay? Share this with someone who likes dark, slow mysteries and the questions they force upon us.